So welcome everyone. It is great to be here today. It's great to be alive today. It's one of the biggest things. And we thank you so much for joining the webinar. Our focus today is how to make sure students are engaged when remote teaching. And as we know, what has happened to many of us is we were launched into remote teaching in a very quick manner. And so if you've been doing it now for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, you may be wondering if your students are engaged and how to keep them engaged as you go through kind of closing out the academic year or even into the summer. With that, I want to model for you today some ways to always make sure that your students are engaged, and that's to engage them as much as possible with some really well-grounded inquiry-based teaching strategies of questioning. So as we start today, in the chat box, could each of you use 1 or 2 words to describe exactly how you might be feeling right now? Whatever that might be, whether that is hopeful or that is disorganized or frustrated, whatever it might be. It also, when you do this with your own students, it gives you a sense of where they're at and also gives them the opportunity to show that you actually care and that you're connecting with them. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds. And as you can see, kind of in the chat box, there's a wide range, and that will probably be true of any of your students if you're a K-12 teacher or even higher ed. It's always great as we start sessions with our students, if they're synchronous, to check in with them and to have an idea of how they're feeling, get a sense of where they're at emotionally. What we need to always keep in presence of our own mind, and we have subsequent webinars that will talk around navigating the stress of this time, is that none of us have ever been through a worldwide pandemic before. So we get to be new. And what that also means is that there are a myriad of responses that we'll be having that are probably unanticipated. The challenge that all of us face in remote teaching is that we are trying sometimes inaccurately to take what we've done face-to-face and move it into an online context. What we really need to do is to re-envision remote teaching. For those of you whom I don't know, I'm Dr. Donna Keel, faculty member at DePaul University, and I teach in the teacher preparation program as well as the educational leadership program. Previous to coming to DePaul, about 7, 8 years ago, I was a high school principal, and before that a high school teacher and a school counselor. And so I come at this with a lens of a personal experience, but also in 2003, I launched the first one-to-one laptop program in a school, in a private school in Illinois. That gave me a great deal of expertise that I really wasn't planning on in how to do remote teaching. And really the reason that I launched the one-to-one program was not to have technology as the new gadget for my students, but was really to level the playing field, to give those students who tend to be, or the students who are at risk, to give them an opportunity that they wouldn't have otherwise. And what I found after the course of 10 years of doing that, when I measured this in 2013, was that remote teaching for my students who were highest at risk allowed them to improve exponentially. And so what I'm going to share with you are some of the strategies that I've discovered in that process, and also some of the research around best practices in remote teaching so that it's focused on engaging students, and give you some opportunities that maybe you can try out in your own teaching as you move forward. So our learning outcomes for this webinar are really to examine what your role is in remote teaching, to give you a framework that comes from some research around how students succeed when learning in an online context, to give you strategies of how to get student attention, to look at problem-based learning as a way to increase student engagement in a remote setting or face-to-face, and how you can keep student engagement. So yes, we will be providing the slides in the near future. So if you want those slides, we will definitely find a way to get those to you. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to put those in the chat, and or since our group is relatively manageable with 22, you can also raise your hand and I'm happy to call on you as well as we go through. So the first thing that we really need to do is to look at how we can change the role of the instructor. When we move to remote teaching, actually, I find it to be a transformational experience that allows us to step away from teacher-centered learning and move toward student-centered learning. When we look at teacher-centered learning, which is what we've been doing for generations and for a long, long time, is in teacher-centered learning, the teacher's the center because they are the font of knowledge. We are transmitting our knowledge from ourselves to our students. We students are those passive receivers that we always hope are calmly just engaged and hanging on our every word. And as Paul can attest, that always happened to me when I was lecturing in my own classes. That's being sarcastic. But the emphasis in teacher-centered learning is on the acquisition of knowledge outside of the context in which it's used. So when we have teacher-centered learning, we're giving students knowledge that they would within a classroom setting. And so now they're going to take that knowledge and go put it hopefully to practice in a situation that's more akin to whatever the discipline is we're studying. In student-centered learning, which is the opposite of teacher-centered learning, the student is at the center and is the focus of the instruction, and instruction goes from the teacher to the student in a way that empowers the student and acknowledges the student's interests first, and also what the student background knowledge might be, and it has student voice as the central component in learning. As you're doing remote teaching, I'd ask you to consider, and maybe many of you have done this already, and if you have, put it right in the center of, put it in the chat room. Have you asked your students what they want to learn? Have you asked your students how they learn best away from school? Have you asked your students what their home situation is like in terms of what time they can access learning, what the noise level is, how they've been, what's their daily routine like since they've been home? Those key little points of information are really essential to student-centered learning. In the graduate course I'm teaching right now, we began the quarter right after the stay-at-home order, and the first thing that I had my students do is to fill out a pretty lengthy questionnaire that asked them all of those questions. And because that changes each day, I continually ask them. And I love that, whoever Malahari is, that you ask those questions at the start of each day. That's a great practice. One of the things that when we shift to student-centered learning, and for those of us who are K-12 teachers, we really have to allow for student choice and autonomy in a way that we may not have been comfortable with in face-to-face. We also want to have more open-ended questions that encourage critical thinking and creative thinking, and have inquiry be the driver of our instruction, and encourage student collaboration and group projects. The hardest thing for us as teachers, and I can say this from my own experience, is sometimes letting go of that control. So when we have students look at problems from a critical lens and go out and get information on their own, we're often letting go of our control of navigating that information. If we want to have students be fully engaged, choice is important. It's also a part of andragogical practice or adult learning theory. Adult learning theory would say that the way adults learn best is they get to choose what they're learning. So in this webinar is a great example. You chose this webinar. You're more likely to show up because you chose the topic, because you need the topic. And in student-centered learning, we also give students a chance for reflection, for individual self-paced assignments, and we get them, and ideally in student-centered learning, we get them involved in community-based activities that they're interested in, that they can do safely and remotely, and service-based activities. Any questions so far? You can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. If you were my students right now, I would ask you this question, but I want to be sensitive to your time. But if you were my students right now, I'd ask you which of those 7 points resonated with you most closely. And then I'd have you put that in the chat. So if you want to answer that question, that would be great. But for the sake of time, I'll move through the rest of the material as well. Here's a big shift for us. It's in who you are. So as teachers, we tend to be the person in charge of our class, as we should be when we're face-to-face. When we shift to remote teaching, we need to shift what our identity says we are, from that person who's in charge of everything, who has all of the answers, to the person who is the storyteller, the mentor, the content expert still, the designer of the instruction, the facilitator, and the coach. You notice it doesn't say instructor. And that's because we want the students to carry the cognitive load when we're doing remote teaching. We want the students to do the thinking and to do the self-instruction needed to have a meaningful learning experience in a remote teaching situation. I'd like to share with you a research-driven framework that can help you starting today with designing your remote or online instruction, depending if you're using a learning management system or if you're using Google Classroom as a learning management system. And the research comes from Zhang and Bonk, and they did this research back in 2008 to see in the situation where students are successful learning remotely or learning online, what was present. And what they found was that there were some key criteria. As they sorted through all of the data on why were some online remote teaching situations successful and others bombed, what they found was instructors who had successful experiences addressed all learning modalities. So they directly, in their remote instruction, in any unit of instruction, they addressed visual and auditory learners, reflective and observational learners, visual learners, and those haptic or hands-on learners who like kinesthetics kind of learning. They not necessarily did it in a sequential order, but within a unit or a lesson, there were opportunities for students to engage in every modality of learning, so that if I tended to be a visual learner, there would be something in it for me to address my learning style in the remote teaching situation. If I was more of a verbal or auditory learner, or I like to just read, there would be something for me. So they developed then this framework with that data that they entitled R2D2, so you could remember it. I used to have in this presentation a little icon of R2D2, and then I realized I don't have licensing rights for that. So imagine the little Star Wars R2D2. And that this can give you that structure, that framework of how to balance both synchronous and asynchronous. Universal design for learning is another way to look at, another framework to consider. So thank you, Mr. K, for that. And then I like Matt's question is, how do we balance an effective cognitive student load versus overwhelming our students given the shift of context and potentially explicit role change? Outstanding question. Here's the thing. Just like the delicate balance that happens face-to-face when a teacher knows rather instinctively when to ease off with students in a remote teaching situation, it requires a great deal of inquiry and questioning of students to know when so that you get the data in order to assess how much cognitive load is appropriate. And I'll show you some strategies for that in this session, and then in future webinars, we go through it more deeply. One of the ways that I do it too is to employ the Harvard DataWise protocols of getting data from my students every time I do a synchronous session, I'll gather data. Every time I do asynchronous learning, there's sources of data that come back, and then we need to balance where are students disconnecting, when are students connecting. Our role really changes when we go to remote learning. We go from teacher to researcher. What we're doing as remote teachers is really just researching when are students learning, when are they not learning. It's the constant quest of assessment. So hopefully that's answering your question in some portion. So if we look at the R2D2 model that's up on the screen, the R2D2 stands for reading, reflecting, displaying, and doing. And so when we look at those modalities, if you look on the center of the circle, we know that in the reading area, we really are trying to just orientate our students to some knowledge. We have foundational knowledge that we need for them to get, whether that's a chapter of a textbook that we, according to a district, are required to teach, or whether that's some Common Core standards that have knowledge attached to them. In the reflecting area, we're really looking at now, how do we take that knowledge and how do we really construct it in new ways so that we're moving up Bloom's taxonomy too, as you notice. And then in the displaying area, we're really looking at, now we can move into, according to Bloom's, that analysis and how we can re-represent that knowledge in different formats. And then we get to the higher level of Bloom's taxonomy of we're actually then creating and synthesizing that knowledge into a new kind of reality. If you're doing this asynchronously or synchronously, I want to break apart R2D2 for you so that you can see how powerful it is. So if we break apart that first part, which is auditory and verbal learners, but also those learners who like to read passively. So those learners, they prefer words, they prefer sounds, they prefer spoken and written application. They just are people who like a lot of language around their learning. They're the ones who like to sit through our lectures. They're the ones who like to read the chapters of the book. That's definitely not me, but those are learners who, when we're giving them information, they like to do podcasts, PDF readings, PowerPoint presentations that are recorded. They like to have web quests or newsletters or ebooks. And typically, this is a kind of a traditional part of learning, is we ask students to read a chapter of a text. We ask students to listen to something. In high quality remote learning, there's small portions of this, and I can't emphasize enough small portions. So if you're doing asynchronous learning, if you're recording a lecture, if you're recording a PowerPoint, and if you can try to never have them exceed 7 minutes, you're on target with what the research would say is best for supporting student learning. I actually just heard from a little sophomore in high school who said she adores her teacher, a history teacher, absolutely loves her, but she has these 25-minute lectures she's recorded that the student has to listen to every day. And she said, I love her, but I cannot stand her voice anymore. Here's the thing. 25 minutes for a sophomore is way too long. 25 minutes for almost any of us is way too long. There's a reason that commercials are only 3 minutes. There's a reason that YouTubes are typically 5 to 7 minutes. That's typically how long we can really stay attuned and attentive to something that's recorded. So keep that in mind when you're creating the R of R2D2. So if you think of this R2D2 and you think of a theme or a topic that you have to teach coming up, you can see, what is it that I want to give them in terms of words? What way can I express this so I can hit some of the, use some technology tools and give them the content? Then we go to the second R, which is the reflect. Very typical in online learning is that you allow then students to make an opinion or to reflect, internalize the knowledge that they've gotten. And you could do this a few ways, whether you have a learning management system or you don't. But if you can create a Google Doc that's a discussion question around a reading, or you can have students write or create a portfolio, or you can have them do a reflective journal. Journaling is a really powerful tool. And here's one hint for you who are teachers right now, because this is really stressful for teachers. You should have a journal open every day. And all throughout your day, you should be jotting down just what your feelings are. In subsequent webinars, we talk about navigating the stress for teachers. And one of the keys to navigating stress for us is to be able to name our feelings, but also to be able to draw our feelings, to be able to use art. So if you have a journal next to you, you can draw pictures as you're getting a lesson ready, or as you're grading, or you can, as you're dealing with parents and dealing with kids. Having that journal open so you can kind of keep a chronology of your feelings through this is really important. What I've found from my own lens is, with working with K-12 teachers as I have over the past 8 weeks, is that what you're going through seems to be mirroring Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. So there's been this denial, then going through anger, then going through a kind of bargaining that's really about fear, you know, especially as they released, you know, the May 1st guidelines about going back to school. It's like, could we go back? Do we go back? Those kinds of things. Then it goes to kind of an acceptance and almost a joyfulness, like, oh, I can handle this. And then it goes right back to anger and denial, and it keeps cycling through. By keeping a journal, you'll help yourself to get through those emotions more productively. If we go to the D, the display for visual learners, this is when really powerfully technology tools that are pretty powerful can really help your learners. So let's say you're teaching about the Vietnam War. I'm using a social studies example because I know some of you on the line are social studies teachers. So you're teaching the concepts of the Vietnam War. You've given them a reading, maybe something from the Library of Congress that's a primary source. You've asked them then to reflect on that reading with a discussion question or a small group activity that has them talk in pairs online and then synthesize that and write it to you. And then now what you can ask them to do is a concept map. Take what you've read, take your discussion, and create a concept map that really maps out for me every key idea that moved you, that inspired you. And what you've now created is an opportunity for students who are visual learners to really integrate that learning into a new way. And there's great concept maps that are free. One that I use a lot is Text 2 Mind Map. The number 2 is actually in a numerical format. But what they do is allow students to have this really graphic visualization that can be downloaded as a PDF and then sent to you. The final D in the R2D2 is the do. So it's having students actually create something, whether that creation is a digital story, it's a movie, it's a PowerPoint that they present to you synchronously, or they record for you. One of the most important things about engaging students in remote learning is to consider the importance that learning is a process and not a product. So if we shift our mindset, which is a very 19th century mindset, that learning is a product, we're not learning how to put widgets into a widget maker. We're learning the process of thinking, having our students do videos of themselves thinking aloud as they work on the things that we want them to learn is far more meaningful than having them write an essay. So having students actually do something that says, as you think about this problem, or as you think about the group experience you had as you were just dissecting the Vietnam War, talk to me about what was going through your head. Talk to me about what you were remembering. Talk to me about what you were learning. Let them create it. Student creativity can really surge in a time of crisis because creativity is the way to navigate fear. So the solution, the opposite of fear is not courage, because courage is an action. The opposite of fear is creativity. So if you can engage your students creatively, you've helped with their fear. You also help with your own fear if you happen to be anxious about what's happening. So here's a way to get student attention as you're going through remote teaching. Design instruction that's meaningful. We all try to do that every day. Keep in mind that it should be student-centered. Create meaningful interactions in your instruction and connect students with each other. Because what we know is the principles of learning that come from all of the learning theories are still the same. It doesn't matter if we're in person or we're virtual. If we look at the fact that the way that we learn anything is that it has to have meaning for us personally. There has to be some type of language base so that we can take what the meaning is and we can integrate it into our minds. There has to be human-to-human interaction, and we know that all learning happens in relationship. It's the first night of all of my classes that learning happens in relationship. You can still have a relationship even in a remote setting. How we process that information also remains the same. So the process, the cognitive process that every teacher keeps in mind, and this is something that you probably all learned in your teacher training, is that first you have to gain student attention. Then students encode information cognitively. They store information. And then at the final process is they retrieve information. And usually that's through an assessment. The important part is what kind of engagement occurs when in this process of learning anything new. And there are different levels of engagement. And according to Schlechte, who did all the research around engagement, what he found were 5 levels of engagement. Engagement where there's high attention and high commitment, engagement where there's high attention, low commitment, engagement where there's low attention, low commitment, no attention, no commitment, and diverted attention, no commitment. I think for many of our students right now, they have no diverted attention or rebellion, where there's diverted attention and no commitment. They don't want to do the work. They come to it very resistantly. Or there's retreatism where they aren't even clicking on any kind of Google Classroom. Where we really want to bring our students to is that engagement that's at the highest level. And in order to get there, we need to have that high commitment occur in the process of encoding, storing, and retrieving information, and the attention coming when we actually give the information. In order to get that high attention, that high commitment, we have to make it purposeful and meaningful. So we know that when we have ritual compliance or strategic compliance, we are not going to get the commitment we need. You know, the reality of ritual compliance, which is what a lot of us are going through right now, is a student might get there, but their attention is low. And if it's strategic compliance, they might have a little bit of high attention, but they're really not going to follow through. They'll show up for us to the online meeting that we may have had, or they'll click into the Google Classroom, but there won't be any follow through. What we really want to do to empower them is to make sure that what we're teaching them brings them value, that we grab their attention in many forms, that we give them real life application, and that there's a commitment to the process. The way to do that is to give them choice. And the way to get, after we give them choice, to give them also ownership and responsibility. So there's something about saying, do you want out of a choice board, for example, and hopefully if you've made some choice boards thus far when you're doing your remote teaching, put that in the chat, because choice boards are really powerful learning tools. But give them choice. Once they have choice, now they own that choice. So now we've just moved them to empowerment, and then that results in deep learning. So if we were to present students with a table that has 3 rows across the top, and then 3 rows across going horizontally, 3 rows going vertically, and within each of the rows we had a focused criterion and we had a choice for their learning. That's a lot of work for us, but on the flip side, we will meet every learning modality and we will create. That's great, Sue. Sue made one for ELA. Choice boards are really common too in the arts. They really are very meaningful if we do them in the traditional disciplines of math, of social studies, of science, to create those choice boards of what is the topic and the modality of learning that you might want. The most powerful way that I know to learn both face-to-face and to teach both face-to-face as well as remotely is problem-based learning. Back in 2003, when I launched the first one-to-one program, that's how I did all of my, had my teachers do all the classes. And we had half the school that was face-to-face, and we had a big portion of the school that would do remote learning because they were high at-risk students who others wanted to expel, but I wanted to be able to reach them in a new and meaningful way. Problem-based learning, if you don't know it, is student-centered pedagogical practice that really focuses on students embracing a problem that matters to them and then finding solutions. If we compare traditional learning to PBL, we know that in traditional learning, we're driven by our textbook, we have fixed units, we are comparing all the time. The technology is just meant to be that peripheral thing that delivers learning. Students are usually working alone and students are receivers, and the goal is mastery of some facts. That's typical. That's usually what your district might want you to do because that's been the tradition. But if we look at shifting that, especially now, to being all PBL, we start with really not looking at just our content area if we happen to be secondary. And if we're in K through 8, we have the advantage of typically then we're 2 to 3 content areas, but we look to interdisciplinary problems. We look at criteria rather than test and compare, and we look at having students become discoverers of their learning rather than those receivers of learning. And it starts really simply with a really strong, good big question, a little bit different than essential question. It's a big question that actually the kids come up with. And it's a great question of how is project-based different from problem-based. The real difference is the kids are solving a current active problem that exists right now in the world that matters to them. In project-based learning, typically the teacher is designing a project that might eventually solve a problem. But right now, when you look at problem-based learning, you're looking at what is a problem that exists that's related to our content area that you want to solve. So if you are a social studies teacher and if you're focused on a theme of civil rights, is there a problem right now in the area of civil rights that you want to solve? And the reality to that is there's lots of them, and students can easily pick issues of access and equity to technology, healthcare, whatever they might want to, and then they have to frame the problem for you. The teacher's role is in helping them to dissect a problem to something manageable that happens to then also be aligned to your standards that you're teaching to. I love Sue's question of where does blended learning fit in? And if we think about blended, the traditional definition of blended is where some is online and some is face-to-face, and we shift that definition to fit our current circumstances, is that students have to go out and they have to do readings associated with perhaps the problem we want them to explore, and then they come up with the problem. So for example, you need them to read a chapter, let's go back to social studies. You need for them to read a chapter on Vietnam. So they read a chapter on Vietnam and you ask them, come up with the question for a problem that exists today that might have been triggered as you read this chapter. So you're taking a very traditional type of, you're having them do work outside of the technology, reading a chapter of a book, coming back to now where you're meeting them technologically, and you're talking to them about, well, now how can we design some problem-based learning? Any other questions? Great. Has anyone done, before I go on, has anyone done Genius Hour while they've been doing remote teaching or done it before in their classroom? If you have, you could just put that in the chat or raise your hand. In future webinars, I'm going to cover more specifically what Genius Hour is, but I would say of all of the remote teaching practices that I've been sharing with CPS specifically and with many of our Catholic schools, Genius Hour has had the most overwhelmingly positive results. Genius Hour is something that I've traditionally done myself when I teach graduate classes, but also when I was a high school or middle school teacher that I always used. If you're not familiar with Genius Hour, you can email Innovate and I can send you a bunch of worksheets, but there's also many, many of them online. But it really, during a remote situation, gives you the opportunity to give student voice and autonomy in their learning and still be able to tie it back to standards that you need to teach to and to outcomes that you may need to teach to. And Matt, we definitely can give you the link. Of Genius Hour, the real concept very simply, and I'll break it down just a little bit, is that students are selecting areas of content for which they feel really passionate about and where they can show their inner genius. So they're creating something that shows a talent or a skill that's just theirs. It emerged from Google. Google used to do Genius Hour with their employees. So the folks at Google would give you an hour a day that was all yours. You didn't have to do any specific work. You just had to do whatever you wanted to work on for that hour a day. What they found was, and it didn't have to be within the department where you worked. So if you happened to be in the mailroom, you still got a Genius Hour. What they found was when they took off the parameters and they said, you have this hour, and they would ask them then to share what they came up with in their hour, that the most creative uses of Google technologies, of ideas in Google came out of that Genius Hour. That once people didn't have the parameters of now I am your math teacher, you can only do math, for example, once we said, no, any discipline, any time, what do you want to study? What do you want to invent? Use an hour a day that's just yours, but give me an hour. Give me an hour. It doesn't have to be where it's a synchronous session at all. It shouldn't be, actually, but just tell me an hour a day where you're going to work on something. Give me the idea, and then we'll break it down together. So if we're looking at problem solving, problem-based learning, there are 7 key steps. If you're not familiar with them, I just mapped them out for you here. It really begins with a student choosing a problem. The student states already what's known about the problem. So if a student's already starting to look at maybe civil rights, for example, as it relates to COVID-19, great thing for them to solve. They can say, what do they know already, to be factual. This is when students become really clear on how to know a primary source, how to detect factual information, and exactly what they may or may not know. It gives you great insight into know what's their foundational knowledge. The student defines all the issues as they see them. You help them unpack those issues. So a student may say that one of the issues is that women are not being impacted by COVID-19 as much as men. Is that fact or not? You help them to ask those questions. You say, how do you know this? Is it true? Where are you getting your data from? So all you're doing is asking questions instead of reviewing responses. Students then go out and research the knowledge that they need. They name what they need to know. So here's all the things I need to know. It's as if they are creating a little mini research project. They investigate the solutions. Then they present and support their own chosen solution. So out of Genius Hour recently, with the pandemic, came a high school students project, which was to offer to Lori Lightfoot a plan for how to use student voice in her campaigns to help people to wear masks. It was a brilliant plan. One that was so good that the teacher and I are going to send it to the mayor's office, but it was a great idea for using student voice in a real strategic way that talked about the students as the future. So they present their supported solution, and then what you do is you review the performance. So you've got something very clear and concrete. If you have a problem that students really latch onto, whether you're an English teacher, whether you're a 3rd grade teacher, you can unpack where the discipline is that they're having some learning about. In the example with the campaign where Student Voice was talking about wearing masks in the city of Chicago, the student had to learn how to present an essay in a compelling manner. So, and I'm blanking on the name of the type of essay, persuasive essay, there you go. And the student had to do some mathematics around how many students, how many people in Chicago needed to have this message, what communities in Chicago. So they did lots of math. They had to actually then unpack what the current policy and what the current law states around the city of Chicago, where that came from. So they did some civics and some history of Chicago. So they got to know a lot of different information that, by the way, I bet that student will know more clearly the whole idea of how many representatives they have, how many, how the mayor's office works. They'll know it more deeply for any kind of history test than they would have known had they just studied that out of their textbook. Any questions? So here's 4 keys to keeping your student attention when you're doing remote. And I'm not doing it well right now because I want to be sensitive of your time, but assess frequently with open-ended inquiry-based questions, so that if I were teaching you and if you were K-12 students, I would be asking continually for a check-in on how you're feeling and whether or not the material is interesting to you. I would be asking you for thumbs up, thumbs down, like we do generally when we're teaching face-to-face. I would want to give you frequent feedback. So even verbally, I'd want to say, you're on target. Can you explore that further? Note that in your journal. Let's get back to that next week. And another way is to share stories. What I do with my graduate students at the beginning of our synchronous sessions, which I always keep to only 25 minutes, is I share a story and ask them to share a story. Actually, another strategy I use, and I do this with my graduate students as well, each week I send them an email that is nothing to do with academics, and I call it a story, a song, and a silly moment. And so I share a short story, either about teaching or my own life. Then I share with them an inspirational song or a song that lifted my spirits. And then I share with them a silly moment that I've encountered either through Twitter, which there's lots of them out there, or in my own life, or in our exchanges together. In turn, without my saying you must at all, they keep sharing back with me. I get to know them, but it also is that power of story. The power of story to unite us with our learners is really important. It will keep them attentive. It will keep them engaged. The final strategy is to do peer review and peer editing, and kids are better at this than we give them credit for. But giving them the opportunity to give each other feedback will help them with actually how to be in greater discussions of a critical nature with each other. Do you have any questions? And I think I am actually almost on time. I am. Any comments? Well, it's been great being here with all of you today. We promise to keep this to 45 minutes because we know how remote teaching and how daunting remote teaching can be. Please do, if you have any follow-up comments or questions for me or for anyone at DePaul, you can use that Innovate email. Brennan will make sure that those directed directly for me will get to me. You can also email me directly at dkiel@depaul.edu. We hope this has been helpful. We'll have future webinars on navigating stress as well as assessing students remotely, and also on, Genius Hour specifically, just because it's a powerful teaching tool. So I look forward to hopefully connecting with you folks again. Take care, everyone.